speculation. On the other, Morris agreed to harbour his uncle and Miss Hazeltine, who had come to grief with the rest, and to pay to each of them £1 a month as pocket money. The allowance was amply sufficient for the old man. It scarce appears how Miss Hazeltine contrived to dress upon it, but she did, and what is more, she never complained. She was indeed sincerely attached to her incompetent guardian. He had never been unkind. His age spoke for him loudly. There was something appealing in his whole-souled quest of knowledge, an innocent delight in the smallest mark of admiration. And though the lawyer had warned her she was being sacrificed, Julia had refused to add to the perplexities of Uncle Joseph. In a large, dreary house in John Street, Bloomsbury, these four dwelt together, a family in appearance, in reality a financial association. Julia and Uncle Joseph were, of course, slaves. John, a gentleman with a taste for the banjo, the music hall, the Gaiety bar, and the sporting papers, must have been anywhere a secondary figure, and the cares and delights of empire devolved entirely upon Morris. That these are inextricably intermixed is one of the commonplaces with which the bland essayist consoles the incompetent and the obscure. But in the case of Morris, the bitter must have largely outweighed the sweet. He grudged no trouble to himself, he spared none to others. He called the servants in the morning, he served out the stores with his own hand, he took soundings of the sherry, he numbered the remainder biscuits. Painful scenes took place over the weekly bills, and the cook was frequently impeached, and the tradespeople came and hectored with him in the back parlour upon a question of 3 farthings. The superficial might have deemed him a miser. In his own eyes he was simply a man who had been defrauded. The world owed him £7,800, and he intended that the world should pay. But it was in his dealings with Joseph that Morris's character particularly shone. His uncle was a rather gambling stock, in which he had invested heavily, and he spared no pains in nursing the security. The old man was seen monthly by a physician, whether he was well or ill. His diet, his raiment, his occasional outings, now to Brighton, now to Bournemouth, were doled out to him like pap to infants. In bad weather he must keep the house. In good weather, by 9:30 he must be ready in the hall. Morris would see that he had gloves and that his shoes were sound, and the pair would start for the leather business arm in arm. The way there was probably dreary enough, for there was no pretence of friendly feeling. Morris had never ceased to upbraid his guardian with his defalcation, and to lament the burden of Miss Hazeltine. And Joseph, though he was a mild enough soul, regarded his nephew with something very near akin to hatred. But the way there was nothing to the journey back, for the mere sight of the place of business, as well as every detail of its transactions, was enough to poison life for any Finsbury. Joseph's name was still over the door. It was he who still signed the cheques, but this was only policy on the part of Morris, and designed to discourage other members of the tontine. In reality, the business was entirely his, and he found it an inheritance of sorrows. He tried to sell it, and the offers he received were quite derisory. He tried to extend it, and it was only the liabilities he succeeded in extending; to restrict it, and it was only the profits he managed to restrict. Nobody had ever made money out of that concern except the capable Scot, who retired, after his discharge, to the neighbourhood of Banff, and built a castle with his profits. The memory of this fallacious Caledonian Morris would revile daily, as he sat in the private office opening his mail, with old Joseph at another table, sullenly awaiting orders, or savagely affixing signatures to he knew not what. And when the man of the heather pushed cynicism so far as to send him the announcement of his second marriage, to Davidia, elder daughter of the Reverend Alexander Macraw, it was really supposed that Morris would have a fit. Business hours in the Finsbury leather trade had been cut to the quick. Even Morris's strong sense of duty to himself was not strong enough to dally within those walls and under the shadow of that bankruptcy, and presently the manager and clerks would draw a long breath, and compose themselves for another day of procrastination. Raw haste, on the authority of my Lord Tennyson, is half sister to delay, but the business habits are certainly her uncles. Meanwhile, the leather merchant would lead his living investment back to John Street like a puppy dog, and having there immured him in the hall, would depart for the day on the quest of seal rings, the only passion of his life. Joseph had more than the vanity of man, he had that of lecturers. He owned he was in fault, although more sinned against by the capable Scot than sinning; but had he steeped his hands in gore, he would still not deserve to be thus dragged at the chariot wheels of a young man, to sit a captive in the halls of his own leather business, to be entertained with mortifying comments on his whole career, to have his costume examined, his collar pulled up, the presence of his mittens verified, and to be taken out and brought home in custody, like an infant with a nurse. At the thought of it his soul would swell with venom, and he would make haste to hang up his hat and coat, and the detested mittens, and slink upstairs to Julia and his note books. The drawing room, at least, was sacred from Morris. It belonged to the old man and to the young girl. It was there that she made her dresses. It was there that he inked his spectacles over the registration of disconnected facts and the calculation of insignificant statistics. Here he would sometimes lament his connection with the tontine. "If it were not for that," he cried one afternoon, "he would not care to keep me. I might be a free man, Julia, and I could so easily support myself by giving lectures." "To be sure you could," said she. "And I think it one of the meanest things he ever did to deprive you of that amusement. There were those nice people at the Isle of Cats, wasn't it, who wrote and asked you so very kindly to give them an address. I did think he might have let you go to the Isle of Cats." "He is a man of no intelligence," cried Joseph. "He lives here literally surrounded by the absorbing spectacle of life, and for all the good it does him he might just as well be in his coffin. Think of his opportunities. The heart of any other young man would burn within him at the chance. The amount of information that I have it in my power to convey, if he would only listen, is a thing that beggars language, Julia." "Whatever you do, my dear, you mustn't excite yourself," said Julia. "For you know, if you look at all ill, the doctor will be sent for." "That is very true," returned the old man humbly. "I will compose myself with a little study." He thumbed his gallery of notebooks. "I wonder," he said, "I wonder, since I see that your hands are occupied, whether it might not interest you." "Why, of course it would," cried Julia. "Read me one of your nice stories, there's a dear." He had the volume down and his spectacles on his nose instanter, as though to forestall some possible retraction. "What I propose to read to you," said he, skimming through the pages, "is the notes of a highly important conversation with a Dutch courier of the name of David Abbas, which is the Latin for abbot. Its results are so well worth the money it cost me; for, as Abbas at first appeared somewhat impatient, I was induced to, what I believe singularly called, stand him drink. It runs only to about 25 pages. Yes, here it is." He cleared his throat and began to read. Mr. Finsbury, according to his own report, contributed about 499/500 of the interview, and elicited from Abbas literally nothing. It was dull for Julia, who did not require to listen; for the Dutch courier, who had to answer, it must have been a perfect nightmare. It would seem as if he had consoled himself by frequent appliances to the bottle. It would even seem that, towards the end, he had ceased to depend on Joseph's frugal generosity, and called for the flagon on his own account. The effect, at least, of some mellowing influence was visible in the record. Abbas became suddenly a willing witness. He began to volunteer disclosures, and Julia had just looked up from her seam with something like a smile, when Morris burst into the house, eagerly calling for his uncle, and the next instant plunged into the room, waving in the air the evening paper. It was indeed with great news that he came charged. The demise was announced of Lieutenant General Sir Glasgow Biggar, KCSI, KCMG, etc., and the prize of the tontine now lay between the Finsbury brothers. Here was Morris's opportunity at last. The brothers had never, it is true, been cordial. When word came that Joseph was in Asia Minor, Masterman had expressed himself with irritation. "I call it simply indecent," he had said. "Mark my words, we shall hear of him next at the North Pole." And these bitter expressions had been reported to the traveller on his return. What was worse, Masterman had